I've been hiking and camping since I was a teenager, so when my friend suggested we spend the weekend in Red Pine Forest, I was all in. It's a dense stretch of woods in upstate New York, notorious for its eerie atmosphere and a handful of unexplained disappearances. But we weren't afraid. We were just out to disconnect, enjoy some beers around the campfire, and tell a few ghost stories of our own. It was me, Jake, Sarah, and Laura. We set out early Friday morning, and the hike into the forest was beautiful at first. The trees stretched endlessly, their thick canopy casting everything in a shadowy green glow. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the air felt heavy, like the forest was watching us. We shrugged it off, laughed even. "It's just the isolation playing tricks on us," Jake said, setting up his tent. But that night, things took a turn. We were sitting around the fire, swapping stories, when Laura mentioned the legend of the Red Pine Witch. Supposedly, she was a woman who had been accused of witchcraft back in the 1700s. The townsfolk dragged her into the forest, tied her to a tree, and burned her alive. They say she cursed the land with her dying breath, and anyone who stays in her woods is never the same, or never seen again. It was the usual campfire nonsense. We laughed, rolled our eyes, and blamed the rustling trees on the wind. But deep down, I could feel an unease creeping over me. It wasn't the story itself. It was the silence that followed. No crickets, no owls, no wind. Just the crackling of the fire and the weight of the dark forest pressing in around us. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I was sharing a tent with Jake, while Sarah and Laura shared another. As I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the tent ceiling, I heard it. A faint humming, like someone was singing far off in the woods. It wasn't a melody I recognized. It was slow, mournful, and sent chills crawling down my spine. "Jake," I whispered. "You hear that?" He grunted, half asleep. "It's probably Sarah or Laura messing with us." But it wasn't. I could see the outline of their tent through the thin fabric of ours. No one was moving. The humming stopped as suddenly as it started. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a bird, maybe, or just my imagination. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, Sarah was acting weird. She looked pale, like she hadn't slept at all, and kept glancing over her shoulder. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and muttered, "Bad dreams." We hiked deeper into the woods that day, exploring trails that hadn't seen human footprints in years. That's when we found it. A massive tree, its bark charred black like it had been struck by lightning. There were symbols carved into the trunk, strange shapes that didn't look like anything natural. Sarah froze when she saw it. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. Jake laughed it off. "It's just an old tree, probably from a storm or something." But Sarah wouldn't go near it. She stayed back, arms crossed, staring at it like it was alive. I'll admit, something about that tree made my skin crawl. The air around it felt colder, and the forest seemed quieter than ever. That night, the humming came back. It was louder this time, and it wasn't alone. I could hear faint whispers beneath it, like a dozen voices murmuring just out of reach. I sat up, my heart racing, and realized Jake was awake too. He was staring at the tent wall, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded. "It's coming from the tree." I wanted to tell him he was crazy, but deep down, I knew he was right. The humming, the whispers, they were coming from the direction of that blackened tree. I wanted to wake Sarah and Laura, but before I could move, the sound stopped again. The next morning, Sarah was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty, her boots still by the tent. We called her name, searched the clearing, but she was nowhere to be found. Laura was frantic, tears streaming down her face. She wouldn't just leave, she kept saying. She wouldn't go into the woods alone. But it was obvious she had, or something had taken her. We searched for hours, calling her name, until the sun started to set. That's when we found her footprints in the dirt, leading straight to the blackened tree. They stopped just a few feet from its base. No sign of her, no struggle, just nothing. Laura refused to stay another night. She packed her bag and insisted we leave, but it was already too dark to hike out. Reluctantly, we decided to wait until morning. None of us slept. Around 3 a.m., the humming came back, louder than ever. It wasn't distant this time. It was right outside the tents. I held my breath, clutching the flashlight like a weapon as the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were almost screams. And then they stopped. I didn't dare move. I could hear Laura crying softly in the other tent and Jake whispering something under his breath. A prayer, maybe. When dawn finally came, we packed up and ran. We didn't even bother taking the trail. We just ran until we broke through the tree line and stumbled into the parking lot. My legs were shaking, my lungs burning, but I didn't care. We were out. But Sarah wasn't. We reported her disappearance to the rangers, but they never found anything. No footprints, no clothing, no body. Just an empty campsite and that cursed tree. It's been 5 years, and I still can't explain what happened. Sometimes I hear that humming in my dreams. Sometimes I wake up and swear I can smell smoke, like burning wood or flesh. If you ever find yourself near Red Pine Forest, do yourself a favor. Stay away, because once you hear the humming, it's already too late.
Story number 2.
It's strange how something as simple as a road trip can change your life forever. My name is Andy, and I'm telling you this because I need someone to hear it. I need someone to know what happened to us in that cursed stretch of forest. It started as a weekend getaway with my girlfriend, Mia, and our 2 friends, Ethan and Jen. We'd planned a camping trip to Cedar Hollow, a place Mia's uncle used to rave about before he passed. It was a bit off the beaten path, miles of dense forest with no cell service. That's what we wanted, an escape. We left early Saturday morning, our car packed with gear, snacks, and high spirits. The drive was long, but uneventful. By late afternoon, we'd parked at a small lot near the trailhead and started the hike toward the campsite. The air smelled fresh, the kind of crisp, earthy scent that makes you feel alive. The trail was well marked, winding through towering pines and clusters of ferns. By the time we reached the site, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. It was picturesque. A small creek trickled nearby, and the trees formed a natural canopy overhead. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and by dusk we were roasting marshmallows over a roaring fire. As the stars came out, Ethan suggested we tell ghost stories. It felt cliché, but we were all in the mood. Ethan kicked things off with a tale about a haunted asylum, followed by Mia's story about a phantom hitchhiker. Then Jen spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "Have you guys heard about the Hollow Folk?" she asked, staring into the fire. We shook our heads. "It's an old local legend," she continued. "My grandma used to tell me about them. She said they're spirits of people who got lost in the woods and never found their way out. They don't know they're dead, so they wander endlessly, trying to find someone to take their place. If you see one, you're not supposed to talk to them or follow them. If you do, you'll end up just like them." There was a long silence after Jen finished. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the sudden chill in the air. "Well, good thing we've got a map and a flashlight, right?" Jen didn't laugh. She just stared into the flames, her face unreadable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the tent next to Mia, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely human. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then I heard a voice, soft, almost a whisper. It was a woman, calling out. "Hello? Is someone there?" My heart pounded in my chest. I nudged Mia awake and whispered, "Did you hear that?" She groaned, half asleep. "It's probably Jen or Ethan." But it wasn't. I peeked out of the tent and saw Jen and Ethan's tent zipped up tight. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I need help." I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. Mia grabbed my arm. "Andy, don't." "It might be someone who's lost," I said, though my voice wavered. "What if they're hurt?" Mia reluctantly followed me as I stepped into the clearing. The fire had burned low, casting everything in flickering shadows. The voice called out again, coming from the edge of the woods. "Hello? Please, help me." I aimed the flashlight toward the trees, and that's when I saw her. A woman in a pale dress standing just beyond the tree line. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her arms dangled at her sides. Something about her posture was wrong, like she was standing too still, too stiff. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked deeper into the woods. "Wait," I called, taking a step forward. Mia grabbed my arm. "Andy, no. Remember what Jen said." I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground. The woman paused, just visible between the trees, and turned her head to look back at me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they weren't right. They were too large, too dark, and they seemed to glisten in the flashlight beam. A chill ran down my spine. Mia pulled me back toward the tent, her grip firm. "Come on, let's just go back." We didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, we told Jen and Ethan what had happened. Jen's face turned white as a sheet. "I told you not to talk to them," she said. "Now they know you're here." Ethan rolled his eyes. "It was probably just some weirdo messing around. Let's pack up and get out of here." We agreed. But as we were breaking camp, we noticed something strange. Around the clearing, in the dirt and pine needles, were footprints. Barefoot, human footprints. They circled our tents and led off into the woods, toward the direction where I'd seen the woman. We didn't stop to think. We grabbed our gear and started back toward the car. The trail seemed different in the daylight, like it had shifted somehow. Trees I didn't remember seeing before loomed over us, their gnarled branches forming twisted shapes. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. About an hour into the hike, we realized we were lost. The trail markers were gone, and no matter which direction we turned, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan swore under his breath, and Jen kept glancing over her shoulder, muttering prayers under her breath. Then we heard it, a soft humming coming from somewhere up ahead. It was faint but unmistakable, carrying a melody that sent shivers down my spine. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered. Before anyone could answer, the humming stopped. In its place came the voice. "Hello? Please help me." It was the same voice from the night before, but closer this time. Too close. We turned and started running, our gear bouncing against our backs. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees blurring together in a dizzying maze. And then we saw her. The woman in the pale dress, standing in the middle of the trail, her head tilted slightly, and her dark, unblinking eyes locked onto mine. Ethan screamed, breaking the spell, and we bolted in the opposite direction. I didn't look back, but I could hear something behind us. Footsteps, whispers, that eerie humming. Finally, we burst into the parking lot, gasping for air, but something was wrong. Our car wasn't there. The lot was empty, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. It looked abandoned, like no one had been there in years. Jen started sobbing, and Ethan dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Mia clung to me, her nails digging into my arm. "This can't be real," she whispered. "This can't be happening." The humming started again, louder this time, surrounding us. Shadows moved at the edge of the lot, flickering in and out of sight. The woman's voice called out one last time. "Stay with us." That's the last thing I remember before everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of a road. A passing driver found me and called for help. They said I was miles from Cedar Hollow, with no sign of Mia, Ethan, or Jen. The authorities searched for weeks but found nothing. No campsite, no car, no trace of my friends. I've told this story to countless people, but no one believes me. They think I made it up, that the trauma broke something in my mind. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there in those woods. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it again. That soft humming just beyond my window.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a simple trip, a weekend away from the noise and chaos of the city. My brother Matt and I had been planning it for months, ever since he moved back to town. He'd been dealing with a lot lately, a nasty breakup, a job he hated, and I thought sometime in nature might help him clear his head. So, when he suggested we go camping in Ashwood Forest, I didn't think twice. Ashwood wasn't your typical forest. It had a reputation, though not a good one. People said it was cursed, that strange things happened there. Hikers claimed to get turned around on familiar trails, hearing whispers in the wind or seeing shapes dart between the trees. A few had gone missing altogether, their cars found parked at the trailhead with no sign of them inside. We laughed it off as small-town nonsense. Superstitions, stories to keep kids from wandering too far. We were experienced campers, and the thought of getting lost in the woods seemed ridiculous. We set out on a cool Friday morning, the car packed with everything we'd need, tents, sleeping bags, enough food and water to last us days. The drive took a few hours, winding through increasingly rural roads until we reached the entrance to Ashwood. The air smelled different there, sharper, tinged with pine and something else I couldn't quite place. The trailhead was empty, save for a single rusted pickup truck parked haphazardly on the edge of the lot. Matt joked that it looked like something out of a horror movie. "I guess we're the dumb characters who don't listen to the warnings," he said with a grin. The trail itself was beautiful at first, sunlight streaming through the canopy, leaves crunching underfoot. We hiked for hours, chatting about everything and nothing, until we found a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. We set up camp, built a fire, and spent the evening cooking hot dogs and talking about old times. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. The cheerful rustling of leaves gave way to an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your heart beat louder. I chalked it up to being out of my element, away from the hum of the city, but it still put me on edge. It was around midnight when Matt suggested we take a walk. "Come on," he said. Let's check out the stars. You can't see them like this back home. Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and set off down the trail, the beam of light slicing through the darkness. The stars were incredible, like someone had spilled glitter across the sky, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The first sign that something was wrong came about 15 minutes into our walk. The trail seemed different. The trees were denser, their branches gnarled and twisted like outstretched hands. The dirt path we'd been following was now littered with jagged rocks, and the stream we'd been walking alongside was nowhere to be seen. I think we took a wrong turn, I said, stopping to look around. Matt frowned. No way, we've been going straight this whole time. But the more we looked, the less familiar it seemed. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow stretched long and menacing. When we turned back to retrace our steps, the trail we'd come down was gone, swallowed by the forest. Okay, this is weird, Matt said, his voice shaky. The air felt heavier now, colder. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were sweating, my heart racing. Let's just keep walking, I said. We'll find the campsite eventually. We walked for what felt like hours, our flashlights barely cutting through the thickening darkness. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. And then we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl coming from somewhere behind us. Did you hear that? Matt whispered, his eyes wide. I nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter. Probably an animal, I said, though I didn't believe it. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. Whatever it was big, and it was getting closer. We broke into a run, the forest a blur of shadows and shapes around us. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate, matching our pace. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eventually, we stumbled into another clearing, gasping for air. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was suffocating, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. What the hell was that? Matt panted, doubling over with his hands on his knees. I don't know, I said, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. But we need to keep moving. That's when we noticed the cabin. It stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The wood was dark and rotting, the windows shattered, but it was shelter. Without a word, we made our way to it, pushing open the creaking door and stepping inside. The air inside was damp and stale, filled with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, and the walls were scratched with deep grooves like something with claws had been here. We shouldn't be here, Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. But what choice did we have? We barricaded the door with an old table and huddled in the corner, our flashlights pointed toward the entrance. For a while, it was quiet, and I started to think maybe we were safe. But then the footsteps came back, circling the cabin. At first, they were slow and deliberate, crunching on the dead leaves outside. Then they grew faster, erratic, like whatever was out there was running. The growling started again, low and guttural, accompanied by sharp, scraping sounds against the walls. Andy? Matt whispered, his voice trembling. What is that? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The noises grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right on top of us. The cabin shook, the door rattling against the makeshift barricade. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. We didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, until the first light of dawn crept through the shattered windows. When we finally stepped outside, the forest was still, the morning air crisp and cold. There were no signs of whatever had chased us, no footprints, no scratches on the cabin walls. It was like it had never happened. But as we made our way back to the trailhead, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the trunk of a nearby tree, in deep, jagged letters, was a single word. Stay. We didn't. We never spoke about what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone else. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I hear it. The growling, the footsteps, the scraping against the walls. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too deep into the woods.
Story number 4.
It started as an impulsive idea, one of those why-not decisions you make on a slow weekend. My roommate Jake and I wanted to do something different, something adventurous. We'd been stuck in the same routine for months. Work, Netflix, repeat. and when Jake suggested an overnight camping trip, I agreed without hesitation. We decided on Blackwater Forest, a sprawling stretch of wilderness about 2 hours from our apartment. It wasn't a popular spot, mostly because the forest had a dark reputation. Locals told stories of strange disappearances and whispered about a legend they called the Watcher. Supposedly, anyone who ventured too deep into the woods risked being marked by the Watcher, whatever that meant. We didn't buy into the stories. To us, it sounded like an urban legend designed to keep curious teenagers away. Jake even joked about trying to summon the Watcher, like it was some kind of campfire game. We packed light, just a tent, some snacks, a couple of beers, and our phones, even though we knew we wouldn't have service. By late afternoon, we were driving down the gravel road that led to the forest's trailhead. The parking lot was empty when we arrived, which wasn't surprising. Blackwater wasn't exactly a tourist destination. As we started hiking, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the dirt path and the occasional rustle of leaves. Jake, as always, was oblivious. He was too busy taking selfies and making jokes about the Watcher. "Do you think they have an Instagram?" he said, laughing as he snapped a photo of himself against the backdrop of towering trees. The sun was low in the sky when we found a small clearing to set up camp. It was picturesque, surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to touch the clouds. We pitched the tent, started a small fire, and cracked open a couple of beers. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to come alive. The rustling in the bushes grew louder, and I swore I saw shadows moving just beyond the firelight. Jake, ever the skeptic, waved it off as deer or raccoons. "Relax," he said, tossing another log onto the fire. "You're letting those stories get to you." I tried to shrug it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, certain I'd catch someone or something lurking in the trees. But there was never anything there. Around midnight, Jake decided he wanted to explore. "Come on," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "Let's see if we can find the Watcher." "Are you serious?" I asked, my stomach twisting in knots. "It's just a legend," he said, rolling his eyes. "Besides, what's the point of coming out here if we're not going to have a little fun?" Against my better judgment, I followed him. The firelight faded as we ventured deeper into the woods, the trees casting long, twisted shadows under the beam of Jake's flashlight. The air grew colder, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps. We walked for what felt like an hour, though it was probably less. The further we went, the stranger the forest became. The trees were gnarled and blackened, their branches curling like claws. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots that seemed deliberately placed to trip us. Then we saw it. In a small clearing ahead, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, a tall, thin silhouette standing perfectly still. But as we approached, the beam of the flashlight revealed something far worse. It wasn't human. The figure was unnaturally tall, its limbs elongated and twisted in impossible ways. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over sharp, angular bones, and its face, or what should have been a face, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin. Jake froze, his hand trembling as he gripped the flashlight. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the thing moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided toward us, silent and impossibly fast. Jake screamed, dropping the flash as we turned and bolted back the way we came. The forest was a maze. Every tree looked the same, and the path we'd followed had disappeared. I could hear Jake ahead of me, his panicked breaths loud in the stillness. The thing was behind us. I didn't need to look to know. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze, or lack thereof, bearing down on me. Somehow, we made it back to the campsite. Jake collapsed by the fire, gasping for air, while I frantically searched for my phone. "Did you see it?" he stammered, his face pale. I nodded, unable to speak. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone, but as I feared, there was no signal. "We have to leave," I said, grabbing my backpack. "Now." Jake didn't argue. We doused the fire, packed what we could, and started back toward the trailhead. But the forest had other plans. The trail was gone. No matter which direction we turned, we found ourselves back at the campsite. It was like the forest was alive, twisting and shifting to keep us trapped. And then we heard it. A low guttural sound like a growl echoed through the trees. It was followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping like claws on wood. Jake grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with terror. "It's coming," he whispered. The growling grew louder, closer, and then we saw it again. The figure emerged from the shadows, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move right, its limbs jerking and twisting as it advanced. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Jake with me. We ran blindly, the creature's growl echoing in our ears. The forest blurred around us, the trees stretching and warping in the darkness. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Suddenly, Jake tripped, falling hard onto the ground. I turned back to help him, but he was already scrambling to his feet. "Go!" he yelled. "Don't stop!" But before we could take another step, the creature was there. It loomed over us, its featureless face inches from mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Its hand, or what should have been a hand, reached out, long, spindly fingers wrapping around Jake's wrist. "No!" I screamed, grabbing a nearby branch and swinging it with all my strength. The branch shattered against the creature's arm, but it didn't even flinch. Jake's screams echoed through the forest as the creature dragged him into the shadows. I tried to follow, but the darkness swallowed them whole. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was in the forest, and the next I was stumbling into the parking lot, the sun just beginning to rise. Jake's car was still there, but he wasn't. The police didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They searched the forest for days, but found nothing. No sign of Jake, no campsite, no creature. It's been 6 months, and I still hear his screams every night. I don't know what that thing was or why it let me go, but I know one thing for certain. Blackwater Forest isn't just a legend. The Watcher is real.
Story number 5.
It was a warm summer evening, the kind where the air hums with the sounds of cicadas and the scent of pine hangs heavy in the breeze. My girlfriend, Lily, and I had decided to do something spontaneous, something fun. We'd been cooped up in our small apartment for weeks, and when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I couldn't say no. We chose Silverwood Forest, a secluded spot about 3 hours from the city. Neither of us had been there before, but we'd heard it was beautiful. Dense trees, crystal clear lakes, and plenty of quiet. Perfect for unplugging from the chaos of everyday life. We packed light. A tent, some snacks, flashlights, and a couple of sleeping bags. I'll admit, I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, but Lily loved the wilderness. She'd grown up camping with her family and knew her way around a forest better than anyone I'd ever met. The drive to Silverwood was uneventful, the roads winding through rolling hills and sleepy little towns. We arrived at the trailhead just before sunset. The lot was empty except for a single mud-covered sedan parked near the edge. It didn't look like it had been moved in weeks. "Creepy," Lily said, nudging me with a playful grin. "Maybe it belongs to Bigfoot." I laughed, but something about the car unsettled me. I shook it off. We were here to have fun, not let silly things get in the way. The trail was gorgeous, with towering trees that formed a canopy above us, casting long shadows across the ground. Lily led the way, her backpack bouncing as she walked. The forest was alive with sound, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. We hiked for about an hour before we found a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. Lily set up the tent while I started a fire, and soon we were sitting under the stars, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. But as the night deepened, the forest began to change. The cheerful sounds of nature faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to stop, leaving the air heavy and still. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Lily replied, looking up from her marshmallow. "Nothing," I said, frowning. "Exactly. It's too quiet." She shrugged. "Maybe the animals went to sleep." I tried to convince myself she was right, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Around midnight, Lily suggested we go for a walk. "Come on," she said, grabbing my hand. "The stars are amazing out here. Let's find a better spot to see them." I hesitated, but eventually agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and set off down the trail, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The forest felt different at night, almost alive. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal fingers. Every sound, a snapping twig, a distant rustle, set my nerves on edge. We walked for about 10 minutes before we came to a small hill overlooking the forest. The view was breathtaking, the sky filled with more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. For a moment I forgot about the strange silence, lost in the beauty of it all. But then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the moonlight. But as I squinted, I realized it was moving, something tall and thin, standing between the trees. "Lily," I said, my voice trembling. "Do you see that?" She followed my gaze and froze. What is that?" The The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally jerky, like a puppet on strings. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes. They glowed faintly in the darkness. 2 pinpricks of pale light that sent a chill down my spine. "Run," Lily whispered, grabbing my arm. We turned and bolted back toward the campsite, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as we stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind us, I could hear it. The sound of footsteps, impossibly fast, crashing through the underbrush. We reached the campsite in what felt like seconds, panting and frantic. The fire had gone out, leaving the clearing bathed in darkness. Lily scrambled into the tent while I grabbed the biggest stick I could find, holding it like a weapon. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then from just beyond the edge of the clearing, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with a laugh. "Stay in the tent," I whispered to Lily, my voice shaking. She didn't argue. The growl came again, closer this time. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then it stepped into the clearing. The figure was taller than I'd realized, its limbs impossibly thin and twisted. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void. A black emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around it. It tilted its head as if studying me, and then it spoke. But the voice wasn't its own. It was mine. "Stay," it said, the word distorted and wrong, like a recording played backward. "Stay with us." I froze, the stick slipping from my hands. The thing took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. And then Lily screamed. The sound snapped me out of my trance. I grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the tent, not caring where we ran as long as it was away from that thing. We ran blindly through the forest, the creature's distorted voice echoing behind us. "Stay," it called, over and over, the words stretching and warping into something unrecognizable. Somehow, we made it back to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, our car sitting exactly where we'd left it. We jumped in, locking the doors and peeling out onto the gravel road without looking back. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" Lily whispered, her hands shaking on her lap. "I don't know," I said, my voice hollow. "But we're never going back." For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, those glowing eyes, that empty face. I started researching Silverwood Forest, desperate for answers, but all I found were more stories like ours. People seeing figures in the woods, hearing voices that weren't their own. The locals had a name for it, the mimic. No one knows what it is or where it came from, but they all say the same thing. Once you've seen it, it doesn't let you go. It's been months now, and I haven't been back to the forest. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, a voice faint and distorted whispering from the shadows. "Stay."
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend getaway. Just me, my best friend David, and his younger sister Emily heading up to Ravens Hollow for a couple of nights of camping. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, and though I wasn't much of a camper, David assured me it would be easy. Nothing too remote, just a hike, a campfire, and some s'mores under the stars. We arrived at Ravens Hollow on a Friday afternoon. The forest was sprawling, ancient, the kind of place where the trees seemed alive, their twisted branches casting long shadows over the trail. There was a strange beauty to it, but something about the place felt wrong. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to seem paranoid. David led the way as we hiked deeper into the woods, Emily trailing behind him, humming some pop song. The path was well marked at first, but as we moved farther in, it began to narrow. The air grew cooler, the sunlight dimming as the canopy thickened overhead. The sounds of the forest, birds chirping, insects buzzing, started to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked after a while, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" David replied, looking back. "That's the thing," she said, frowning. "There's nothing to hear. No birds, no crickets. It's too quiet." David shrugged it off. "We're in deep. Animals probably don't hang out here much." But I wasn't convinced. I felt like we were being watched, though I couldn't see anyone, or anything, in the trees. We finally found a clearing just before sunset. It was a small circular space surrounded by massive oaks, their branches forming a natural barrier around us. There was something almost claustrophobic about it, but David declared it perfect. We set up the tent, gathered some wood, and lit a small fire. As the darkness settled in, we sat around the flames, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Emily joked about the forest being haunted, her voice dripping with mock fear. They say Raven's Hollow is cursed, she said, wiggling her fingers like a cheesy movie ghost. People disappear here all the time. They get lost, or they're taken by something. Something? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Legend says it's the Raven Man, she continued, her voice low and dramatic. They say he's this tall, shadowy figure with a raven's head. He watches from the trees, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. David rolled his eyes. Please, Em, that's just a story to scare kids. There's no Raven Man. Maybe, she said, smirking. But then again, how do you explain all the people who've gone missing out here? I laughed nervously, but the truth was her story unnerved me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, hidden in the darkness beyond the firelight. Later that night, we crawled into the tent, leaving the fire burning low. David fell asleep almost immediately, but I lay awake, staring at the nylon ceiling. The forest was still unnervingly quiet, and every so often I thought I heard something, a faint rustling like footsteps in the underbrush. Around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cool air hitting me like a slap. The fire was nearly out, casting a dim orange glow across the clearing. I stood there for a moment, listening, and then I saw it. Just beyond the circle of light, where the shadows were thickest, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, tall, thin, standing perfectly still. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't right. Its head was misshapen, elongated, with something protruding from the top. It looked like feathers. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze on me, heavy and cold. I took a step back, and the thing tilted its head, mimicking my movement. David, I whispered, my voice barely audible. David, wake up! He didn't stir. The figure took a step forward, its long, spindly legs moving unnaturally like it was floating more than walking. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. That's when the sound started. A low, guttural croaking, like the call of a raven, but distorted, wrong. It echoed through the clearing, sending chills down my spine. David! I shouted this time, scrambling to my feet. He and Emily burst out of the tent, their faces pale with confusion. What's going on? David demanded, but I couldn't answer. I just pointed toward the trees. The figure was gone. What the hell are you talking about? David asked, his voice sharp with irritation. There was something out there, I said, my voice shaking. It was watching us. David grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing, then into the trees. Nothing. You're imagining things, he said. Get some sleep. But I couldn't. I sat by the fire for the rest of the night, clutching a stick like it would do anything to protect me. The figure didn't return, or if it did, I didn't see it. By morning, I was a wreck, but David insisted we stay another night. You probably just freaked yourself out, he said. You've been watching too many horror movies. Emily agreed, though she seemed uneasy. We'll stick close to camp, she said. No hiking, no wandering, just a quiet day. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get through the next night without seeing whatever it was I'd seen. The day passed uneventfully, and by sunset I was starting to think David was right. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. But then night fell. It started with the sounds. At first, they were faint. Soft rustling, the crack of a branch. Then came the croaking, louder this time, echoing through the trees. David stood up, grabbing the flashlight. Stay here, he said, his voice tense. No way, I said. I'm coming with you. Emily hesitated, then followed. We moved as a group, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sounds grew louder as we approached the edge of the clearing, the croaking turning into something that sounded almost like laughter. And then we saw it. The figure stepped out of the shadows, its full form illuminated by the flashlight. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its head was unmistakably that of a raven, but its eyes were human, dark, sunken, and filled with malice. It opened its beak and a voice came out. Emily's voice. Help me, it said, distorted and wrong. Emily screamed, grabbing David's arm. What the hell is that? She cried. The creature tilted its head, its human eyes locking onto me. Stay, it croaked, stepping closer. We bolted. The three of us ran blindly through the forest, the sound of the creature's laughter chasing us. I didn't look back, but I could hear it. Those impossibly fast footsteps, the croaking, the laughter. Somehow we made it back to the car. David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and we peeled out of the lot without a second glance. We didn't speak on the drive home. None of us wanted to admit what we'd seen, or what had almost happened. It's been a year, and I still dream about that thing. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear it outside my window, croaking and laughing. David refuses to talk about it, and Emily moved across the country. I haven't been camping since, and I never will again, because I know it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 7.
It was my first solo trip. I had always dreamed of hiking and camping alone, deep in the wilderness, where no one could disturb the serenity. It wasn't just about the adventure, it was about the challenge. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, that I didn't need anyone else to survive in nature. The Appalachian Trails had always been a bucket list destination for me, so I picked a less traveled route near Black Ridge Peak. The trail was remote, winding through dense forest, rocky cliffs, and misty valleys. I knew the area was infamous for its isolation and unpredictable weather, but that only added to the allure. I packed light but smart, a sturdy tent, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, a satellite phone, and a map of the area. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just my sister, who thought the whole idea was ridiculous. "What if you get lost?" she'd said. "What if something happens and no one can help you?" I laughed it off. "I'll be fine. People do this all the time." The drive to the trailhead took longer than I expected, winding through small, forgotten towns and gravel roads. I arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. The parking lot was empty except for my car, which only made me feel more adventurous. The first day of hiking was uneventful. The forest was breathtaking. Towering oaks and maples, their leaves a vibrant green, the air thick with the earthy scent of moss and wildflowers. I passed a small creek around midday and stopped to fill my water bottle, the sound of running water soothing my nerves. By evening, I found a perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a view of the valley below. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and ate a simple dinner while listening to the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, everything I had hoped for. But that night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the hoot of an owl. It was a steady, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on wood. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from somewhere in the trees, not far from my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool night air. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I shone the flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing. The tapping had stopped. I told myself it was probably just a woodpecker or a branch swaying in the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I continued hiking, pushing deeper into the forest. The trail became harder to follow, overgrown with brush and littered with fallen branches. My map said I was on the right path, but the farther I went, the less sure I felt. Around midday, I stumbled upon something strange. It was a small clearing, but the trees around it were different. They were twisted, their trunks bent at odd angles like they'd been melted and frozen in place. The ground was littered with dead birds, their bodies perfectly intact, but completely lifeless. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't linger. That night, I camped near a rocky outcrop overlooking a narrow gorge. The view was stunning, but I couldn't enjoy it. The unease from the clearing hadn't left me, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, that same sense of being watched returned. I lit a fire and tried to focus on reading a book I'd brought, but my attention kept drifting to the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees seemed closer than they had during the day, their branches forming unnatural shapes against the night sky. And then the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was closer, louder. It sounded deliberate, like someone was knocking on a tree just beyond the light of my fire. I froze, my eyes scanning the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the tapping, steady and relentless. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees. For a moment, I saw nothing but shadows. But then, at the edge of the light, I saw something move. A figure, tall and thin, stepping between the trees. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. Its head was obscured, but I could see its eyes, glowing faintly like embers in the dark. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I scrambled to grab the flashlight and point it back toward the trees. The figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching a knife, my eyes darting to every shadow, every sound. The growling didn't return, but the forest felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting. By morning, I decided to cut the trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to meet it again. I packed up my gear and started back toward the trailhead, moving as quickly as I could without running. But the forest didn't want me to leave. The trail seemed different, unfamiliar. I followed the map, but no matter which way I went, I kept ending up back at the same spot. The twisted trees and the dead birds. Panic set in. My compass spun wildly, refusing to point north. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting, closing in around me. I tried to stay calm, to think logically, but every path I took led me deeper into the woods. The tapping started again, louder this time, echoing from all directions. And then I heard it, a voice. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer," it said, a whisper carried on the wind. "Come closer." I spun around, trying to find the source, but there was no one there, just trees and shadows. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice breaking. The forest responded with laughter, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The tapping grew louder, faster, surrounding me. And then I saw it again. The figure stepped out from the trees, its body impossibly tall and thin, its head crowned with antlers that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its eyes burned like coals, piercing and unrelenting. It raised one long, spindly arm and pointed at me. "Stay," it said, its voice a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned and ran, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling into the parking lot, my car the only thing in sight. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away without looking back. When I got home, I told myself it was all in my head. I was sleep-deprived, scared, imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest didn't want me there. And whatever lived in those woods, it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 8.
It started as an innocent idea, a weekend getaway to reconnect with nature. My boyfriend, Jake, and I had been under a lot of stress lately, work deadlines, family issues, and the general chaos of life. So when he suggested camping in the secluded Pine Haven forest, I jumped at the opportunity. It was supposed to be a time to unplug, relax, and just breathe. Pine Haven was famous for its towering pines, serene lakes, and untouched beauty. It was also known for being one of the most isolated areas in the region, with little to no cell service. Perfect for escaping the world, or so we thought. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the dirt trail. Jake parked the car near the entrance, and we began our hike to a spot he'd researched online. "It's about 3 miles in," he said, hoisting his backpack. "Completely off the beaten path. No one will bother us." As we ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was beautiful, but there was an eerie stillness to it, as if the forest were holding its breath. After about an hour, we reached a clearing by a small, still lake. The water was so calm it reflected the sky like a mirror. "This is it," Jake said, grinning. "What do you think?" "It's perfect," I replied, though a nagging sense of unease lingered in the back of my mind. We set up camp, pitched the tent, and gathered firewood. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, we were sitting around a crackling fire, roasting hot dogs and laughing. The unease I'd felt earlier started to fade. But then night fell. The forest, which had been so inviting during the day, transformed under the cover of darkness. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the ground. The lake, once serene, now looked like a bottomless void. As we sat by the fire, talking and enjoying the quiet, I began to hear something. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the crackling flames, a soft rustling like leaves brushing against one another. "Do you hear that?" I asked, looking toward the trees. "Hear what?" Jake replied, his voice casual. "Rustling, like footsteps." He paused, listening. The forest was silent. "It's probably just an animal," he said, shrugging. "A deer or something." But it didn't feel like a deer. As the hours dragged on, the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random, like the movement of wind or animals. It was rhythmic, purposeful, circling our campsite. Jake finally noticed it too. He stood up, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" No answer. The light illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. "Maybe we should just go to bed," I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Jake nodded, though he seemed uneasy. We put out the fire and crawled into the tent, zipping it up tight. I lay awake for hours, listening. The rustling had stopped, but the forest was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just an oppressive silence. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the tent. My eyes snapped open, my heart racing. The scraping was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across fabric. "Jake," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Listen." He froze, his eyes wide as the sound continued. It circled the tent, moving from one side to the other, as if someone or something was inspecting it. "Stay here," Jake whispered, grabbing the flashlight. "No," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't go out there. We can't just sit here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll be right back." Before I could stop him, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he scanned the trees. "Hello?" he called out. "If someone's out there, this isn't funny." Silence. I stayed inside the tent, clutching the sleeping bag, my heart pounding. Jake walked around the campsite, the light bobbing as he moved. And then the light went out. "Jake?" I called, panic rising in my chest. No answer. "Jake?" Suddenly the flashlight flickered back on. Jake was standing at the edge of the clearing, facing the trees. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping out of the tent. He didn't respond. I moved closer, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Jake?" When I reached him, I grabbed his arm, and he turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his face pale as a ghost. "We have to go," he whispered. "What? Why?" "There's something out here," he said, his voice trembling. Before I could ask him to explain, a sound echoed through the forest, a low, guttural growl, deep and inhuman. It reverberated through the air, shaking me to my core. Jake grabbed my hand, and we ran. We left everything behind, the tent, the supplies, even the car. All we cared about was getting out of those woods. The growling followed us, growing louder, closer. Whatever it wasn't human. Its footsteps were heavy, crashing through the underbrush like it was tearing the forest apart. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the trees and onto an old dirt road. By some miracle, a pickup truck was driving by. The driver, an older man with a kind face, stopped when he saw us, panting and disheveled. "Are you kids all right?" he asked. "Please," Jake begged. "Just drive." The man didn't ask questions. He let us climb into the cab, and we sped away. As the truck rumbled down the road, I glanced back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw something standing at the tree line, tall, thin, with glowing eyes. I never went back to Pine Haven. Jake and I don't talk about that night. We broke up a few months later, the stress of what happened too much for us to handle. But sometimes in the dead of night, I hear that growl in my dreams, and I wake up, heart racing, convinced that whatever was out there is still looking for me.
Story number 9.
It was the summer after I graduated from college, and my best friends, Emily, Liam, and I, decided to go on one last adventure before we all went our separate ways. We wanted to do something memorable, something that would leave a lasting mark on us before the real world took over. Emily suggested we camp at Raven's Hollow, a secluded forest in the Pacific Northwest, known for its towering redwoods and eerie fog that clung to the ground like a ghostly veil. The area had a reputation for being strange. People whispered about unexplainable lights, strange noises, and even disappearances, but we dismissed it all as urban legend. We were young, bold, and foolish. We arrived at Raven's Hollow on a Friday afternoon, our car packed with gear, snacks, and a reckless sense of adventure. The dirt road to the campsite was bumpy and overgrown, winding deeper and deeper into the forest. By the time we arrived, the sunlight was dim, filtered through the dense canopy of ancient trees. "This place is incredible," Liam said, stepping out of the car and stretching. "Incredible and creepy," Emily added, her eyes scanning the towering trees that loomed over us like silent sentinels. "It's perfect," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We set up camp in a small clearing near a shallow creek. The air was damp and cool, the ground covered in a thick layer of moss. After pitching the tent and gathering firewood, we sat around the fire, laughing and telling stories as the daylight faded into twilight. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere changed. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees casting long, shadowy fingers across the ground. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then we heard it. It started as a faint, distant sound, like someone humming a low, tuneless melody. At first, we thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Liam said, frowning. "What is that?" We all fell silent, straining to listen. The humming seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. It wasn't a pleasant sound, it was unsettling, like the kind of tune someone might hum while doing something terrible. Probably just some weird bird, I said, trying to lighten the mood. But even I didn't believe that. The humming stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind an oppressive silence. We exchanged uneasy glances but decided to brush it off. After all, we were in the middle of the forest. Strange sounds were bound to happen. We retreated to the tent and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged, like the calm before a storm. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching the leaves and twigs just outside the tent. My heart leapt into my throat as I held my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered from beside me, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I replied, barely audible. Liam stirred, groggy but alert. "What's going on?" "Someone's outside," I said, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the deafening silence. Then the tent began to rustle, as if someone was running their fingers along the fabric. "Who's out there?" Liam shouted, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. Emily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" Before anyone could respond, the humming started again, closer this time. It was louder, almost vibrating, and it sent chills down my spine. "Get the flashlight," I whispered to Liam. He fumbled in the dark rack, finally finding it and turning it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness as he unzipped the tent and shone it outside. There was nothing there. "See?" Liam said, trying to sound brave. "Probably just an animal." But as he spoke, the humming grew louder, impossibly loud, surrounding us. And then we saw them. Figures, shadowy and distorted, moved between the trees. They were tall and thin, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. Their faces were blank, featureless, but they turned toward us as if they could see us. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Get in the car," Liam said, his voice firm but shaking. "Now." We scrambled out of the tent, abandoning our gear as we made a mad dash for the car. The figures didn't move, but their heads followed us, their blank faces tilted in unnatural angles. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, as we fumbled with the car keys. "Go, go, go!" Emily shouted as Liam started the engine. The car roared to life, and we sped down the dirt road, the headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. I looked back, and my blood ran cold. The figures were following us, their movements impossibly fast, gliding between the trees like shadows come to life. "Drive faster!" I screamed. "I'm going as fast as I can!" Liam shouted, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The humming was inside the car now, vibrating through the air, through our bones. Emily was sobbing, clutching my arm as I tried to keep my eyes on the road ahead. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figures were gone, the humming silenced. The forest was still, the only sound the hum of the car engine and our ragged breathing. We didn't stop driving until we reached the main road. Even then, we couldn't bring ourselves to speak, the weight of what we'd just experienced too heavy to put into words. When we finally reached civilization, we collapsed in a diner, still shaking. We tried to make sense of it, to rationalize what we'd seen and heard, but there was no explanation. We never went back to Raven's Hollow. We don't even talk about it anymore. But sometimes late at night, I hear that low, tuneless humming in my dreams, and I wake up, certain that they've found me again.